Have you ever, like, gotten stuck in one of those group projects where it feels impossible to get everyone moving in the same direction?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Or maybe you're the one who always ends up doing most of the work, and you just wish there was a better way for everyone to actually, learn together in a group, right?
hmm
I feel like that's such a common experience.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about how amazing collaboration can be, but then you actually try to do it, and it can be really frustrating.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we all see the potential, right? Like there's that idea that you can achieve a deeper understanding, maybe even have some of those aha moments when you're, tossing ideas back and forth. But so often, if you don't have some structure, group work can become more of a headache than a way to really boost your learning.
Totally. And that's why I think this next concept it's so interesting. It's called collaboration scripts.
hmm
It's kind of like, think of it as a deliberate framework, like a set of guidelines for how people should interact when they're learning together. It's not about, putting everyone in a box and being super strict. It's more about like providing a roadmap, a shared understanding of how we're going to work together.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's really cool is that researchers have actually been studying these scripts for a while now, both in like traditional classrooms and in online learning environments, trying to figure out what makes group learning truly effective.
And the research really highlights how important this is because without some guidance, without some structure, you often see groups falling into these patterns of like unequal participation, where some people dominate and others fade into the background. And you get these really superficial discussions that don't go deep enough. And then, of course, it affects how much people learn. It's uneven.
Right, it makes total sense. So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at a really foundational research article from 2006. It's called Collaboration Scripts, a Conceptual Analysis.
Great article.
Yeah, and our goal is to like really get under the hood of these collaboration scripts, understand what makes them work, what makes them not work, what the key components are. Basically, we want to give you, the listener, a clear picture of what these scripts are and how they can help you get more out of those collaborative learning experiences so you can spend less time being frustrated and more time, actually learning and growing with your group.
That's it. And I think this article, it really does lay that groundwork. It breaks down these collaboration scripts into their essential elements and looks at how they've been used in different contexts, which is really helpful for, seeing the practical implications.
So let's just start with the basics.
Yeah.
What exactly is a collaboration script? We get a sense of it from the name, but how do the researchers actually define it?
Well, they put it pretty simply. Collaboration scripts are basically these instructional supports that are meant to like shape the way learners interact with each other during a learning task. The goal is to really boost that collaborative learning process. So imagine, you're in a group and you have this shared understanding of how you're going to work together, how you're going to communicate. That's essentially what a collaboration script provides.
Okay, so it's like it's providing structure for how you interact.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. So what are the must-have components of these scripts? What are those core elements that we see over and over again?
So the research, it consistently points to 5 key components. The first one is what they call learning objectives. And that's pretty straightforward. It's basically asking, what are the learners actually supposed to get out of collaborating? Like, what's the goal? Are they trying to acquire new knowledge? Are they trying to master certain strategies? Or is it something else entirely?
Makes sense. You got to know where you're going,
Right.
right? Like, what's the purpose of all this collaborating? So what's the next key ingredient?
Okay, so number 2 is the type of activities that the learners are actually going to be doing together. What actions are they going to take as a group? This could be things like summarizing information, asking and answering questions, explaining concepts to each other, maybe giving each other feedback on their work, things like that.
So it's not just about like showing up and being in a group. It's about having specific actions to take as a group, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, cool. What's component number 3?
All right, so the third one is sequencing. And this is all about, when those activities should happen, what's the order? Should you maybe brainstorm first and then do research and then present? The timing and flow of those activities can be super important.
Yeah, it's like a dance, right?
Yeah.
The steps have to go in a certain order to make it work. Yeah. Got it. What about number 4?
Okay, so number 4 is role distribution. And this is about, who's doing what in the collaboration. Are there specific roles assigned? Like, is there a leader? Is there someone taking notes, a recorder, someone playing the devil's advocate? Assigning roles like this can be a good way to make sure that different aspects of the task are covered and that everyone has a clear way to contribute. It can also help to prevent those situations where one person ends up doing all the work, you know?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Such a classic problem. And last but not least, the fifth component.
The fifth one is the type of representation, which is basically how the instructions for the collaboration script are actually presented to the learners. So is it written text? Is it a visual diagram or a chart? Maybe spoken instructions. The way the script is communicated can really influence how well people understand it and how effectively they're able to use it.
So just to make sure I've got it, the 5 core components are learning objectives, types of activities, the sequence of those activities, role distribution, and the way the script is presented.
You got it.
Okay, that's super clear. Now, there's this really helpful analogy the article uses to kind of explain these collaboration scripts, and it compares them to, like, cognitive scripts. Like the script we all have for what to do when we go to a restaurant.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. Think about, you walk into a restaurant. We all kind of have this shared understanding of what's going to happen, right? You're going to be greeted, you're going to be seated, you look at the menu, you order, you get your food, you eat, you pay, you leave. It's this routine, almost like a script that we all follow, and it helps the whole thing go smoothly. Collaboration scripts, in a way, they do something similar for learning. They give you that familiar framework, that shared understanding of how to interact in a group setting, so you're not just figuring it out as you go along.
So it frees up your brain to actually focus on the content, on the learning itself, instead of having to worry about the logistics of how to work together, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and I like how you said it's like a shared understanding. So I think that's a really key part of it.
Yeah.
But the article makes an important distinction, right? It says that while our cognitive scripts, like the restaurant example, tend to be pretty rigid,
Right.
you wouldn't usually get the bill before you order your food collaboration serve. Scripts can be much more flexible.
Right.
Some might be super specific, telling you exactly what steps to take and what roles to play, while others might be more like general guidelines, giving you a structure, but also some freedom to adapt and do your own thing.
Yeah, you don't want to create a structure that's so rigid that it prevents those really productive moments that can happen spontaneously, right? Like when you're having a really great discussion and someone comes up with a brilliant idea that wasn't part of the plan, you don't want to shut those moments down.
No, you want to encourage that creativity and flexibility. Now, the article goes on to look at specific examples of these scripts in different settings. So let's start with those designed for face-to-face learning. The first one you mentioned was scripted cooperation, and often it uses this kind of dramatic-sounding acronym, MURDER. What's the story behind that?
Right, well, it's not as scary as it sounds. Murder is just an acronym that outlines the steps in one type of scripted cooperation. It usually involves pairs of students working with a text, like a reading passage, and they break it down into paragraphs. So the M stands for mood, U for understand, R for recall, D for detect, E for elaborate, and R for review. After they read a paragraph individually, they take on specific roles. So one person is the recaller, and their job is to try to remember as much as possible from that paragraph, and the other person is the listener. And the listener is trying to, detect any errors or omissions, anything that the recaller might have missed or gotten wrong.
So right away, you have very clearly defined roles. And then what happens in the other steps, like the elaborate and review steps?
Okay, so after the recall phase, they move into the elaborate phase. And this is where they work together to connect the information from the text to what they already know. They try to make connections, think about real world examples, just really deepen their understanding of the material. And then finally, they might review the key points together. But the really important aspects here are, the sequence, how those activities are structured, and the fact that they have these specific roles. And, to make sure everyone is actively participating, they actually switch roles for each new paragraph. So the person who was recalling now becomes the listener and vice versa. The Mutter script, it's really about forcing you to be active, to retrieve the information from your memory, and to catch those errors. So it's much more engaging than just passively reading the text.
I like that role switching. Make sure everyone gets a chance to engage with the material from different angles. And what are the specific learning goals of this murder script? What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, so the objectives, they're kind of twofold. First, they want learners to actually, acquire knowledge about the content of the text. But second, they also want to help them learn effective strategies for learning from texts. And that includes both cognitive strategies, like explaining things to each other, and also those metacognitive strategies, like monitoring your own understanding.
So learning about the content and learning how to learn. That's great. And how are the instructions for this script usually presented to the learners?
That's interesting because it seems to vary depending on the study. Some studies give learners written instructions after each paragraph, like a little reminder of what their role is and what they should be doing next. Other studies, though, they actually spend a lot of time training the learners on the murder script beforehand, sometimes even for like an hour or more, so that they really internalize the process and they don't need those constant external prompts. It's almost like they're building a habit, you know?
So they're developing an internal script for how to learn together.
That's really cool. Okay, let's move on to the next face-to-face example, which is ask to think, tell, webby why. This one sounds like it puts a big emphasis on questioning.
Absolutely. This approach was developed by Allison King, and it focuses on the power of peer questioning. So you're working in pairs or small groups, and you have these designated roles, a questioner and an explainer. But the really key part is the types of questions that the questioner is supposed to ask. So there are review questions to activate what you already know, thinking questions to really push you to go deeper, probing questions to get at the details, hint questions to provide some guidance when someone's stuck, and even self-monitoring questions to encourage learners to think about their own learning process.
Oh, I like that, the different types of questions. So it's not just about like any old question, it's about being strategic and using questions to really guide the learning. And what about the tell well WHY part? What does that involve? So that's where the explainer comes in. Their role is to provide detailed explanations, to go beyond just stating facts, and to really focus on the why behind things, the reasoning, the connections. They're encouraged to connect the information to their own understanding and also try to relate it to what their partner knows. And it explicitly focuses on developing communication skills, things like active listening and giving your partner enough time to think and respond. With Ask You Think, you're really pushing your partner to understand, and you're also strengthening your own understanding through the process of explaining.
It's like that saying, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough.
Hmm.
Okay, so we have the questioner and the explainer. Is the sequence of activities as structured as in the murder script?
There is a suggested sequence for the questioning, typically starting with those review questions and then moving towards more complex thinking questions. And just like in the murder script, they usually switch roles after they've gone through a cycle of questioning. Often, learners will have prompt cards with example questions, just to help them get started. And the teacher will usually model the questioning techniques for the students before they start working together.
So again, we see those key elements, right? Explicit roles, a defined sequence, and some external support like the prompt cards and also the teacher modeling. Okay, let's talk about the third face-to-face example, which is structured academic controversy. This one sounds like it's designed to create a bit of debate.
Exactly. Yeah, this method was developed by Johnson & Johnson, and it typically involves groups of 4 students. They divide into pairs, and each pair gets assigned a different viewpoint on a topic. Often these viewpoints are opposing, to really spark that debate. And then the pairs do some research and develop arguments to support their assigned position.
So you're starting with disagreement. What happens after they've prepared their arguments?
So each pair presents their arguments to the other pair. This
Hmm.
is where the real controversy comes in, where they're, sharing ideas, information, challenging each other's points. But then there's this really crucial next step, and that's the role reversal. Each pair now has to argue the opposite side, the very position they were just arguing against.
Whoa, that's interesting. So you're forced to understand both sides, not just the one you initially agreed with.
Exactly. It's a really powerful way to promote deeper understanding and also empathy, I think, because you have to really step into the other side's shoes.
For sure. What's the end goal of this whole process?
Well, after they've argued both sides, they set aside their assigned positions and try to work together to reach a consensus. They try to come up with a joint statement that incorporates, the different perspectives and evidence they've encountered. So the learning objectives here, they go beyond just knowledge acquisition. They're also about developing debating skills, critical thinking, and the ability to engage in constructive disagreement.
It's about learning how to have those difficult conversations, to disagree respectfully. I like that. And the structure comes from those distinct phases.
Right?
Right. You're developing a position, presenting it, arguing the opposite, and then finding a synthesis.
Right.
How are roles distributed in this script?
Well, you have roles within the initial pairs, like a presenter and a listener. But then those roles are switched when they have to argue the opposing view. And while the overall sequence is very clear, the actions within each phase they're a bit less prescribed compared to some of the other scripts. There's a little more freedom there. Often they'll have some reminders about the principles of constructive controversy, just to keep things, respectful and productive.
So it's a balance between structure and flexibility. Interesting. Now, the final face-to-face script you mentioned was reciprocal teaching. This one seems to be really focused on reading comprehension.
Yeah, you're right. This method, it was developed by Pellingsar and Brown, and it's specifically aimed at improving reading comprehension and also those metacognitive skills that are so important for monitoring your own understanding as you read. It's particularly helpful for students who struggle with reading, and it revolves around four core strategies: questioning, clarifying, summarizing, and predicting.
And how does the reciprocal part work? What makes it reciprocal?
Okay, so the teacher starts by modeling these four strategies. They'll read a passage out loud and think aloud, showing the students how to ask questions, clarify confusing parts, summarize the main ideas, and make predictions about what's going to happen next. Then the students take turns playing the role of the teacher in a small group setting. So the student who's the teacher for that round leads the discussion about a section of the text using those four strategies. And the actual teacher, they kind of step back and act as a facilitator, providing support when needed, but gradually reducing their involvement as the students become more skilled. And by rotating the teacher role, they make sure that everyone gets a chance to actively practice those reading strategies.
So everyone gets to lead, everyone gets to practice. What about the sequence of those four strategies? Is it strict?
There's the general flow. Yeah, you question, you clarify, you summarize, and then you predict. But it's a bit more flexible than some of the other scripts. Like if the group needs to go back and revisit an earlier strategy, they can do that. And the instructions, they're often presented orally, through that initial teacher modeling. They might not always be written down during the activity itself.
So it's a lot of learning by doing, by observing and practicing, with the teacher initially guiding and then stepping back. Okay, so we've looked at these four examples of collaboration scripts designed for face-to-face learning. What are some of the common threads, the similarities that you see running through all of them?
Yeah, several things stand out. First, they often target both cognitive goals, like understanding the subject matter, and those metacognitive goals, like learning how to learn. They also tend to promote elaborative learning strategies, encouraging learners to really engage with the material, make connections to what they already know, and explain things to each other. The sequence of activities is often very clearly defined, and there's usually a clear distribution of roles, often with some mechanism for switching roles to make sure everyone participates. And finally, they often rely on oral instruction or modeling by the teacher, at least initially.
And it seems like the primary focus is often on the individual learner, even though it's happening in a collaborative context. Like the
Yeah.
goal is for each individual to acquire knowledge and skills, and the collaboration is the tool to get there.
That's a really good point. The assumption seems to be that collaboration is a great way to enhance individual learning.
Right.
And while they might touch on things like communication skills, those aren't usually the main focus in these face-to-face scripts.
Now, we also talked about the potential downside of these scripts, the risk of overscripting. Can you explain why having too much structure could actually be a bad thing?
Yeah, the danger is that if the script is too rigid, if it's dictating every single step and every interaction, it can stifle the natural flow of collaboration. It can limit those open-ended discussions and those moments where people can really build on each other's ideas. It can even make learners feel like they don't have any ownership over the process, which can hurt their motivation. It's really about finding that balance, giving enough structure to be helpful, but also allowing enough flexibility for those spontaneous moments to happen.
So it's like you don't want the script to become the focus, right?
Right.
You want it to be a tool to help people learn, not just a set of rules to follow blindly.
Yeah, you want it to be a support, not a constraint.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about collaboration scripts for online learning. The article also looks at some examples of these. The first one you mentioned was from Baker and Lund in 1997. What did their approach involve?
Right, so Baker and Lund, they created this collaboration script that was actually embedded right into a chat-based learning environment. So you have two students working together on this shared physics diagram, and their task is to, build a model of an energy chain together collaboratively.
Okay, so they're chatting, they're looking at a diagram, they're building something together. How did the script actually guide their interaction within the chat?
The interface had these buttons with like short sentences or sentence starters on them. And these buttons were organized into different categories, like actions related to building the energy chain, phrases for agreeing, prompts for managing the interaction, things like where should we start, and then some general communication options. So when you clicked a button, it would either send a complete sentence or insert a phrase into your text window, and then you could finish the sentence and send it to your partner. So the script, it was like woven into the very way they were communicating.
So it's not like they had a separate set of instructions. It was built into the tool itself.
Interesting. And what were they hoping to achieve with this? What were the learning objectives?
Well, the main goals were to help learners understand those energy concepts by actually going through the process of building that model together. And they also wanted to help them overcome some of the challenges that can happen when you're communicating online through text.
Yeah.
Things like misinterpretations, lack of clarity, missing those nonverbal cues that we rely on when we're face to face.
Right. It can be hard to get your point across clearly sometimes through text alone. So it's like the interface was trying to help with that. What about the sequence of activities and the roles? Were those things clearly defined?
There wasn't a super strict sequence of steps, but the button prompts, they kind of suggested a natural flow to the interaction. And the roles were a bit less explicit. It depended more on which buttons the students chose to use and how they responded to each other. But the instructions for the script, they were represented by the text on those buttons.
So the design of the interface was subtly guiding the collaboration.
That's cool. Okay, the next computer-mediated example is from Hashran and colleagues in 1997, and it involved learners working together to correct errors in biology diagrams. How did that script work?
Okay, so in this one, you had pairs of learners working in a text-based environment, and their task was to, look at these diagrams and identify and correct the errors. And the script, it really revolved around a specific process for reaching agreement. So one learner would get a prompt from the system suggesting that they propose a correction, and then they would type their suggestion and click this button that said, "Do you agree?" And that would send a request to their partner. And the partner had to either agree or disagree with the proposed change. And if they disagreed, they had to explain why. And this back and forth would go on until they reached a consensus, and only then could they actually make the change to the diagram.
Wow, so there's a lot of emphasis on making sure everyone's on the same page before moving forward. What were the learning objectives in this case? The main objectives were, first, to help them learn about biology through the process of correcting those diagrams. But also, they wanted to teach them how to communicate effectively online, specifically around the process of reaching agreement.
So learning the content and also learning how to communicate. And the sequencing seems very tightly controlled by the interface and those "do you agree" prompts. What about the roles?
The roles were a bit more implicit in this one, but they were still there. One learner would usually take on the role of, the composer, the one proposing the changes, and the other would be more of a commentator, providing feedback, agreeing or disagreeing and giving reasons. And of course, these roles would switch back and forth as they worked through the different corrections. The instructions were presented textually through system messages and the button labels. And one thing that's interesting here is that a lot of the structure is actually coming from the technology itself, the interface.
Yeah, it's like the interface is guiding the collaboration without explicitly saying, "these are the rules." It's kind of invisible. The third computer-mediated example is from Fester and Mulfort in 2002, and they called their approach the learning protocol. What was unique about that one?
Okay, so the Learning Protocol, it was designed for chat-based discussions, small groups of 3 to 5 people, and it was used for topics in fields like geology and philosophy. And it had these really interesting features built in to structure the conversation. So first, you had to explicitly say which message you were responding to, like using a little arrow tool to point to the message. And second, you had to categorize your own message as a question, an explanation, or a comment. And then third, the system itself actually controlled who could speak when. Like, it would visually show whose turn it was and even prevent other people from typing until it was their turn.
Wow, that's a lot of structure. It's like a very organized chat room. So what were they hoping to achieve with all this structure?
Their main goals were to help learners deepen their understanding of the topics they were discussing, and also to make the online discussion much more coherent and easy to follow. Because, sometimes online conversations can be all over the place, right?
Yeah, it can be hard to keep track of who's saying what and how it all connects.
Right. So by having people explicitly link their messages and categorize them, it makes it much easier to see the flow of the conversation. And by controlling the turn taking, it prevents people from interrupting each other and talking over each other, which can be a problem in online discussions.
So they're bringing order to the chaos. What about roles in this protocol?
They didn't have official role labels, but the different message types kind of created implicit roles. Like, if you were asking a lot of questions, you were naturally the questioner, and if you were providing a lot of explanations, you were the explainer. But you were free to choose what type of message you wanted to send when it was your turn. The script used a mix of representation, too. Text for the message types and turn information, graphics for those arrows linking the messages, and then the interface itself enforced the sequencing of turns.
Very cool. And finally, we have Camille from Guziel and Turns in 2000. How did that one approach collaboration?
Okay, so CAMIL stands for Collaborative and Multimedia Interactive Learning Environment. It was designed to support these really large online discussion forums, potentially with like tons of participants, and it had this kind of more hands-off approach to structuring. So they focused on three main things: transparency, which meant making it clear who said what and when; facilitation, which involved providing prompts for different types of messages; and anchoring, which meant connecting the discussion to external web pages.
So, less control, more about providing tools and suggestions. What were the learning objectives with this approach?
The learning objectives, they weren't as specific as in some of the other examples, but the general goal was to help people learn about the topic being discussed. Yeah, I think a few key things stand out. First, there's a big emphasis on facilitating communication and coordination in that online environment. And that's often alongside the goal of acquiring knowledge about the topic, of course. The types of activities they support tend to be more communicative, coordinative, although we do see those cognitive elaborative activities as well. The sequencing, it really varies a lot, from very flexible to very controlled by the interface. Roles are often more implicit, and the way the script instructions are presented is mostly textual or graphical, and often integrated right into the platform.
And it seems like the research focus shifts a bit when we move online. We move away from those individual cognitive processes that are often central to the face-to-face research, and we start looking more at the group-level processes, the social dynamics of the interaction.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The research on computer-mediated scripts, it often prioritizes making sure the group is interacting effectively. And the assumption is that if the group is working well, individual learning will naturally follow.
But you also pointed out that there might be less support for those higher-order cognitive activities, things like deep explanation or analysis, in some of these online scripts compared to the face-to-face ones. Why do you think that is?
I think it might be partly because online communication is just different, It's not the same as being face to face. And the tools and interfaces we have available online also shape how we interact. Plus, there might be this assumption that in online settings, people need more help with the basic flow of communication before they can move on to those more complex thinking tasks. But it's definitely an area where online scripts could be improved, where we could find ways to provide more support for that deeper level of engagement.
And what about that advantage of being able to integrate the script into the interface itself? How does that help?
Well, when the script is embedded in the technology, it means learners don't have to consciously process and remember a separate set of instructions, which can reduce their cognitive load. They don't have to think as hard about how to collaborate, so they can free up more mental energy for the learning itself. It makes the whole thing feel more natural and intuitive.
That makes a lot of sense. Less mental effort spent on the rules, more mental effort available for the actual learning. Okay, so now we have this really interesting question. What can researchers who study those face-to-face scripts learn from those who focus on online environments, and vice versa? It seems like each area has its own strengths and approaches.
Definitely. And if we look at it through those 5 components we talked about earlier, those learning objectives, activities, sequencing, roles, and representation, we can see some real opportunities for cross-pollination. So, for example, when it comes to learning objectives, the face-to-face research often emphasizes metacognitive goals, helping learners become more aware of their own learning process. While the computer-mediated research, it often focuses more on those communication and coordination aspects. But I think both could benefit from thinking more about learners' motivation and how feeling over-controlled can actually hurt their desire to learn.
Totally. Like, even if the script is perfect on paper, if people don't feel motivated to use it, it's not going to work. What about the activities themselves?
So the face-to-face scripts, they tend to give you more detailed guidance on how to do those cognitive tasks. Whereas the online scripts, they often focus more on just labeling different activities or communication acts. So there's an opportunity for online scripts to provide more concrete support for deeper cognitive engagement, and for face-to-face scripts to pay more attention to how they're facilitating communication.
So each could learn from the other's strengths.
Yeah.
What about sequencing? We saw some pretty different approaches there.
Right. Face-to-face scripts are often very explicit about the sequence, while online scripts tend to use more implicit sequencing through the design of the interface. But there's no reason why we couldn't combine these approaches. Like, you could design an online interface that provides subtle cues about sequencing, and you could also use those same kinds of cues in a face-to-face setting through visual aids or activity cards.
That's a great point, leveraging the best of both worlds. What about role distribution?
Yeah, face-to-face tends to be very explicit about roles, while online is often more implicit. But the best approach probably depends on the situation, the learners, and the task. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
And finally, the type of representation.
Face-to-face often relies more on oral communication, while online uses more text and graphics. But we need more research to figure out how those different types of representation affect learning and how they interact with, people's different preferences.
Right. It sounds like there's a lot we can learn from bringing those two areas of research together. Now, the article also talks about how research on those two types of scripts is often based on different theories, different ways of thinking about how learning happens. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Right. So research on face-to-face scripts, it's often rooted in cognitive psychology, which focuses on what's happening inside the individual's mind. They see knowledge construction as this individual process of, taking in new information and integrating it.